this emerging new system of international relations isn't just a matter of kind of rebalancing the imperialist powers. It incorporates the rise of the global south. It incorporates China, India, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, the Pacific, the Middle East, all having, a seat at the table, all having some say and some influence in global affairs, which is a huge change. It's a huge shift away from a situation where one countries or one group of countries can just impose its will on others. It means a massive undermining of the US-led imperialist world system. And it's essentially a reiteration of the principles of the United Nations Charter, the principles of international law and of peaceful coexistence. But it's actually, for the first time, it's really being made real by the rise of the global south and of China in particular.
Hello and welcome to Global Majority for Peace podcast. I'm Ileana Chan and we are back from a short hiatus. So just to introduce this podcast again, every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to promote peace and challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. We will be posting the first 30 minutes of this interview on YouTube, and then the full episode will be available on Patreon on Thursday, and then as an audio and transcript on Saturday. So please become a patron on our Patreon and support our work. And if you want to give in a donation, it will just go to covering our costs. So that will be very much appreciated. Okay, so today I am very excited to say that we have Carlos Martinez on our show. Carlos is a researcher and author and political activist from the UK. The East is Still Red: Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century is his latest book. Well, it's a book that you wrote that is really, really good. And I really think everyone needs to read this. It answers almost all the questions that you might have about China and all the misconceptions it clears up. So we'll be talking about this book. But to finish your bio, he is a co-editor of Friends of Socialist China and co-founder of No Cold War. Now, we actually do edit the podcast for Thursday, so that is good news for me. But we are currently live on TikTok, so they get to see the behind the scenes of how inarticulate I really am in real life. So that's great. But anyway, we do welcome Carlos.
No, thank you very much, Ileana, and hey to the viewers. Great to be with you today.
And we usually do start this interview with a personal note. And I'm actually fascinated myself as to how you actually got to become a friend of Socialist China and started that and everything. But often we sort of phrase it in a way of like, what is the origin of your politicization? If you had a particular incident or, what led you to your current worldview?
Sure. Well, yeah. First of all, thanks very much for inviting me on. It's been great to see the launch of Global Majority for Peace over the last few months or year. So an honor and a privilege to be invited. In terms of my origin story, it's not the most exciting or romantic. Essentially, I guess you could say I was a bit of a red diaper baby. Like my parents are or were both Marxist-Leninists. They were both from a kind of pro-China orientation and got involved in politics in the late 60s. And my dad was also involved. So he was Punjabi. He was involved in the Indian Workers Association in this country, which was linked to numerous progressive struggles and obviously the anti-racist movement. And, some of my earliest memories include going to protests, going to meetings, big rallies in Southall, in Greenwich, in Handsworth, in Birmingham, in support of the miners' strike in the mid-1980s or against apartheid in South Africa. I remember I must have been about 11 or 12 when I met Gerry Adams for the first time at a meeting that my dad was part of organizing in Southall in West London. Must have been, I don't know, 1989, 1990, at a time when Gerry Adams' voice was literally banned on British television. So when I did become interested, kind of more actively interested in politics. I had that background and I was just oriented towards the left. In my late teens and early 20s, there were a bunch of things that drew me towards organizing and getting involved. There was the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence in the mid 90s. There was the war on Yugoslavia, NATO's war on Yugoslavia in 1999. There was obviously 9/11, the war on terror, the 20-year war in Afghanistan, a massive increase in Islamophobia that was kind of concomitant with that war on terror. And then obviously the Iraq war in 2003. And, it was kind of a period where we were supposed to be enjoying peace. We were supposed to be enjoying the peace dividend after the conclusion of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. But actually, it was a time of vicious imperialist aggression and domination. And having read and been exposed to a certain amount of Lenin and a certain amount of Marx and a certain amount of Mao Zedong as a teenager, I was kind of able to conceptualize all of that. And I felt like reality confirmed a lot of the political ideas that I grew up with. As for China, I've always been kind of interested in China. My parents, as I said, were pro-China, although very critical of the market reforms that were introduced after Mao's death. And in the last 10 years or so, I've been particularly focused on China, just because I think it's basically a bit of a gap in the market. Like, we're talking about a country that describes itself as socialist, that's led by a communist party, that's doing all these amazing things in terms of poverty alleviation, in terms of renewable energy, and so on. But the Western left, by and large, either ignores it or is actively hostile to it. So I felt, maybe there's a useful role that someone can play there.
Yeah, that brings us really nicely to your book. Whoops. Putting it the right side up would help. The East is Still Red, Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century. It's your pin post on your X profile at agent underscore of underscore change. You state that you wrote this whole book about why the left should support Chinese socialism and why all peace-loving people should stand up against the US-led New Cold War. So let's break some of this down. Why does the left in the West generally have, in your opinion, such a distrustful view of Chinese socialism? And why is that detrimental to expanding the Western left?
Well, there are a few components to this, and you'll have to forgive me being slightly blunt. Firstly, people are pretty ignorant. China is a far off place. People get their views from the mainstream media a lot of the time. Although, I think that's changing, actually, especially over the last couple of years, especially following on from the genocide in Gaza, that people are becoming less trusting in the mainstream media, less trusting in mainstream politicians, and they're starting to question that narrative a lot more, including in relation to China. But that's what the media puts out there, this notion that China's a dystopia, that it's carrying out a genocide against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, that it's suppressing democracy and pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, that it's authoritarian, etc., etc. So, people have got these prejudices in relation to China that prevents them from building solidarity with China. Secondly, again, being a bit frank, people are kind of Eurocentric, and it's not necessarily easy to get your head around China. Like, China's basic philosophical assumptions are different to ours in the West. There's a difference between a basic framework of Confucianism and a basic framework of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So there's a different culture, there are different ways of thinking, and it just makes it a bit more difficult for people in the West to understand what's going on in China and how people think over there. It's not impossible, it's not even difficult, it just requires a bit more effort and a bit more of a creative vision. Even Cuba, which is obviously another socialist country, which is also in the global south, it's also a developing country. I think people find Cuba a bit easier to understand, at least because Cuba's culture and its traditions and its ethics and its philosophy is more westernized, essentially as a function of Spanish colonialism. And then the third aspect is, well, people are dogmatic. The people on the left are dogmatic. And if you read your Marx, you read your Engels, you read your Lenin, and you think about what a socialist society will look like, like the type of society that we as leftists, as socialists, as Marxists, as communists are trying to build, it's probably not very much like what modern China looks like, right? Modern China has huge inequality, it has vast quantities of private capital, it has exploitation of labor, it has millions of migrant workers, it has integration into global value chains, it has stock markets, it has billionaires, it has big Western brands, it has Starbucks, it has KFC, it has McDonald's. I kind of feel the same way. If I were creating a socialist society from scratch, it wouldn't include Starbucks and it wouldn't include billionaires. So people see all this and they say, well, how can this be socialism? And if it's not socialism, then it must be capitalism. But that brings us to a slightly difficult, slightly awkward place, because how do we then explain China's successes on poverty, on renewable energy, on infrastructure development, on managing the COVID-19 pandemic, and so on, if China's just another capitalist country? Are these things even possible under capitalism? And if they are, why don't we see that in other capitalist countries? Why isn't India the global leader in poverty alleviation? Why isn't the US the global leader in renewable energy? So, I think the whole framing of the question reflects at a ideological level a misunderstanding of what the essence of socialism is, that it's not, in my view, primarily about like the relative weight of public and private ownership in an economy. It's primarily about the location of political power, and it's about breaking that correlation between money and power that exists under capitalism. It's about privileging the interests of the people over the interests of capital, and it's about representing the long-term interests of, in particular, the working class and the peasantry. Now, as for why all this misunderstanding is harmful, I mean, it kind of seems obvious, and I don't need to tell you, but why would we want to ascribe all of China's successes to capitalism? And if China's not a socialist country in a world where the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, the European people's democracies don't exist anymore, if China's capitalist, that means that socialism is really in a pretty disastrous state in the world. We should study, we should celebrate, we should uphold, and we should learn from China's successes. China's literally proving to all of humanity that socialism is the only framework under which we can actually solve the major problems that are facing us in terms of poverty, in terms of environmental protection, in terms of building on the basis of common prosperity, in terms of modernizing like as a developing country without going to war, without resorting to imperialism, colonialism, without imposing your will on other countries. So yeah, and from my perspective, developing solidarity with China is really a key and indispensable task for the left and the West.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I also would like to just add, for a little bit of context for some people that might not be aware of how quickly China is developing and how oftentimes the accusations of rampant development, or perhaps like times when the opening of the markets were a little bit less regulated, that things adapt in China according to the needs of the people. So some of the accusations that we might have of China might be like 20 years old, So that's an important factor. But yes, so many people do say, and you kind of covered this, that China is capitalist, therefore China's success is due to capitalism and the opening up of markets by Deng Xiaoping. Do you think you can go over a little bit in terms of there are certain sectors in China that have majority owned, state owned enterprise? Can you break that down for us? Because I think that is not really understood by many people.
Sure. I mean, first thing I'd like to say on this just quickly is that, this idea that China's success is due to capitalism and that was introduced following the Third Plenum in 1978 ignores the fact that China's progress, unprecedented historic progress, doesn't actually start in 1978. It starts in 1949 with the founding of the People's Republic, with the dismantling of feudalism, with the unification of the country, with land reform, the distribution of land to the people that till the land, to the peasantry, an end to, the most brutal oppression of women that characterized Chinese society for many hundreds of years, mass literacy campaign, healthcare, education rolled out to the countryside for the first time, bearing in mind that the countryside is where 90% of the population at that time lived. Major infrastructure projects, the construction of the first industrial base in China. Life expectancy increased from around 35 in 1949 to around like 67, 68 at the time of Mao's death in 1976. So in that period of time, which is 27 years, life expectancy increased by at least 30. So more than 1 year, average life expectancy increases for every year that Mao Zedong was at the helm. So, that's actually a kind of unprecedented achievement. Literacy increased from around 15% to around 80%. The population size doubled. Population had been static in China, kind of between 400 and 500 million for 100 years at least. By the mid to late 70s, it was more like 800, 900 million. If anyone thinks that that's what failure looks like, then they have a pretty warped view of the world. Socialism with Chinese characteristics, so the socialist market economy that started to be rolled out from the late 70s, it's clearly very different to capitalism. As we touched on earlier, like the location of political power is very different in that the capitalist class is not the ruling class in China. There is a capitalist class, there is a group of people who own and deploy capital, but they're not allowed to organize in their own interest. They're not allowed to organize in the specific interests of capital. They're not even allowed to have a capitalist political party. So they're deprived of political power. So far from being the ruling class, they're ruled. Eric Lee puts it really well, and this is something that I've quoted a few times, but in the John Pilger's The Coming War on China documentary, Eric Lee's kind of trying to explain to Pilger, who kind of doesn't quite get it, what's the difference between American capitalism and Chinese socialism. And Eric Lee says, yes, we've got billionaires, we've got capital, but capitalism doesn't enjoy enshrined rights. Billionaires can't tell the Politburo what to do. The Politburo tells billionaires what to do. So the government makes strategic decisions in the interests of the people. The major banks are state-owned, so they're not responsible to shareholders, they're responsible to the people. The companies in the so-called commanding heights of the economy are state-owned, so energy, transport, telecoms, heavy industry, the most important sectors of the economy are run directly by the state. Priority is given to long-term development, sustainability, and improving people's living conditions. And even the bits of the economy that are privately owned or collectively owned are heavily regulated. They're integrated into the planning system. And, if you want to understand the differences between that and capitalism, you can just look at the different results of the two. Like, only China has ended extreme poverty. I would contend that that's impossible in a capitalist society, including capitalist developing countries such as India or Pakistan, and the most advanced Western capitalist countries such as Britain or the United States. Homelessness is a rising problem in capitalist countries. I live in North London. I think you live in South London. I'm sure you don't have to go very far from your apartment to see someone living on the street. I certainly don't. China's solved that problem. China's built by far the world's largest high-speed rail network. Rail, road, telecoms, energy infrastructure, these reach throughout the entire country, throughout the center of the country, throughout the west of the country, even remote areas where it's clearly not profitable to do that. While in the West, our infrastructure is crumbling, right? In the last 50 years in the West, the rich have got richer and the poor have got poorer. Whereas in China, yeah, the rich have got richer, but the poor have also got richer. People live incomparably better compared to 50 years ago. In the big cities, in Beijing, in Shanghai, in Xi'an, in Guangzhou, in Shenzhen, your average life expectancy is comparable with like Spain and Japan, right? These are the countries with the highest average life expectancy in the world. And while per capita GDP might be much lower than the Western countries, the cost of living is also much lower. So, people live very well in those places. In terms of poverty alleviation, as we've mentioned, China has eliminated extreme poverty. And that doesn't just mean that everyone's above that $2 a day income threshold. That also means that everyone's got guaranteed roof over their heads, food on the table, clothes on their back, access to education, mandatory 10 years education, access to healthcare. They get sick, they see a doctor, running water piped into their homes, modern energy, electricity or gas piped into their homes. For most of the third world, right, for most of the global south, to have those 7 guarantees, as they call them, is practically synonymous with being middle class, right? So, no capitalist country has achieved that. Look at the 2007, 2008 financial crisis. The West, the US, Britain introduced stimulus policies and they bailed out the banks. China introduced stimulus policies, which took the form of a massive infrastructure program, getting rail, road, and all sorts of infrastructure to the western and central parts of the country for the first time. That helped keep the economy growing, and it resulted in huge progress developing the country. There's been no crisis in China. There's been no technical recession in China for many, many decades. If you look at the last 50 years, how many economic crises, how many recessions have there been in Britain? How many recessions have there been in the United States? Several. There's been none in China. The British press and the US press talks about a recession or the economy slowing down in China if their growth rate slows to 5%. Meanwhile, we're at 0.1% growth rate. So if the proof of the pudding is in the eating, I think you can see very clearly what the difference is between China's system and Western capitalism are.
Yeah, and that really accounts for why we're always hearing about the coming collapse of China. Like the Western media wants to frame it that way. So we don't understand the achievements and the stability of China currently. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit just wrapped up its annual heads of state meeting in Tianjin, northern China. Obviously, mainstream media is framing this as Xi Jinping's opportunity to create a new world order counter to the erratic leadership of the US under Trump. I say obviously, I mean, obviously, they're framing it this way with nefarious, ominous undertones. It's actually a little bit of a shift in reporting, I feel, and this might be because of Trump. Like he's so overtly imperialist that some people find it difficult to align with him publicly in the West. But can you give us a more objective analysis of what the summit could potentially achieve?
Yeah, I've just seen that the reports have come out of the summit, and including very interestingly, Xi Jinping's announced a new initiative to go with the Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and Global Civilization Initiative. He's just announced the Global Governance Initiative, which, I haven't read the speech yet and seen the details, but I'm very interested to do so. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, along with BRICS and the G77, I think is one of the main pillars of this emerging multipolar world order. And if it's all right to just go into what that means a little bit, because I feel like multipolarity is not a very well understood concept. And people understand, okay, there's a shift from a unipolar situation. It's not like the 1990s anymore, in the sense that there are multiple centers of power. But what they point out is this, well, the world situation in 1914 was also multipolar in the sense that, okay, the US was a power, Britain was a power, France, Germany, Japan, Russia were powers, but there was nothing progressive about it. There was nothing peaceful about it. That was the intense and violent rivalry between competing imperialist powers that led to the awful death and destruction of World War One. So what do we actually mean when we talk about multipolarity? Yes, it means multiple centers of power, but it also means different types of power, which is why Hugo Chavez, the late Venezuelan president, put forward a notion of pluripolarity, which arguably is a more accurate term because it really highlights this emerging new world, this emerging new system of international relations isn't just a matter of kind of rebalancing the imperialist powers. It incorporates the rise of the global south. It incorporates China, India, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, the Pacific, the Middle East, all having, a seat at the table, all having some say and some influence in global affairs, which is a huge change. It's a huge shift away from a situation where one countries or one group of countries can just impose its will on others. It means a massive undermining of the US-led imperialist world system. And it's essentially a reiteration of the principles of the United Nations Charter, the principles of international law and of peaceful coexistence. But it's actually, for the first time, it's really being made real by the rise of the global south and of China in particular. So the SCO, it accounts for 43% of the world's population. So it's a very substantial grouping. It accounts for about a quarter of the global economy. And there's lots of variation in terms of political systems, in terms of level of development, in terms of GDP levels and so on. But there is a recognition that all the countries involved, just like more or less all the countries of the global south, have a shared interest in maintaining peace, building stability, preserving sovereignty, development, and coordinating on security, coordinating on economic development is particularly significant that Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, is attending. This is his first visit to China, I think, since 2018, so in 7 years. And there are some promising signs there of a rapprochement between China and India, which essentially is another way of saying that there are some tentative signs that India is starting to move away from its alignment with that US-led imperialist bloc, which has to be said is a process that's been facilitated by Trump's idiotic tariff policies and whatnot, as you alluded to in your question. Yesterday, Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi pledged to resolve the border differences that exist between them and have existed between India and China since, for many decades, that are, actually a product of British colonialism and the Mile Line and all the rest of it. But, these are problems that have been inherited from history and have to be sorted out. Modi, and I, like probably most of the people watching your podcast, am not a massive fan of Modi, but he made a very correct statement yesterday, which is that the interests of 2.8 billion people of both countries, India and China, are linked to our cooperation. And this will pave the way also for the welfare of entire humanity, which I think is quite a good way of putting it. And India-China rapprochement is like the last thing the West wants to see. And it's what the US and Europe have been working very much against for years, if not decades. But, it's a very important development and potentially very helpful and very promising for the rest of the world. Vladimir Putin is also attending the summit. And that's kind of a little reminder that most of the world hasn't actually cut Russia out in the way that the West has. And the SCO, like other bodies in the global South, takes a neutral position regarding the Ukraine crisis. The Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian, is also attending. Again, this is someone that's a persona non grata in the capitals of Western Europe and North America. But the global South stands with Iran against Israel's criminal attacks and against the West sanctions. And meanwhile, Iran is increasingly looking east. It's looking towards China. It's looking towards Russia for its economic and strategic partnerships. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif is also in attendance. Very positive that the heads of state of both India and Pakistan are there. And hopefully the SCO can help to provide a framework to facilitate dialogue and reduce tensions between India and Pakistan, remembering, of course, that there was a short war between those two countries just a few months ago. So, the whole project is contributing towards building what the Chinese call a global community of shared future, which is based on mutual respect, is based on mutual benefit, it's based on peace and sustainable development.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are just very welcome signs. I think often in the West, though, we tend to be very skeptical of anything that isn't just incredibly horrible destruction versus actually, what you're talking about is just really a rational way to deal with things. It's not insane. It's actually the more obvious common sense way to deal with things. We're just so brainwashed to think that it's like completely impossible. But again, going back to your book, The East is Still Red, you have a chapter entitled Neither Washington Nor Beijing, where you debunk the idea that China is an imperialist country. Can we talk about some concrete differences between the approach of Western imperialism and China's approach? Why isn't the Belt and Road Initiative a form of economic imperialism?
For one thing, imperialism isn't just like an idea or a concept or a policy. It's not something that, a government of any country can just make a decision one day, say, right, we're going to be imperialist now. It's a material reality. What's the material reality of US-led imperialism? It's NATO. It's 800 or 800 plus overseas military bases and the infrastructure power projection around the world. It's a US military budget of $1 trillion a year. It's AUKUS. It's the quadrilateral security dialogue. It's AFRICOM. It's the deployment of troops and weapon systems literally around the world. It's the positioning of the THAAD missile defense systems in Israel, in South Korea, in Okinawa, in Guam, in Japan. And it's a permanent state of war. It's genocide in Gaza. It's a proxy war in Ukraine. It's Iraq. It's 20 years of war in Afghanistan. It's a war of regime change in Libya. It's a war of regime change in Syria. It's a brutal criminal war against Yemen. It's attacks on Iran. And aside from those kind of full-scale wars, it's destabilization and assassinations and regime change operations, such as they're attempting in Venezuela and Nicaragua. It's economic coercion, it's unilateral sanctions, it's structural adjustment programs, loans tied to privatization and deregulation. And it's a whole international economy that's structured to facilitate the domination of the global south by the global north through dollar hegemony, through systems of unequal exchange. So China's approach looks nothing like that. China's got peaceful development literally written into its constitution. China hasn't dropped a bomb on another country in almost half a century, right? China's per capita military spending is about 1/20th of that of the United States. China doesn't have 800 overseas military bases. It's got one in Djibouti, which is there to protect shipping lanes off the coast of the Horn of Africa. China is a nuclear power, but it's the only nuclear power to have a no first use policy. So China, again, has written into its constitution that China would never use nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear country, and it would never use nuclear weapons except in retaliation for a nuclear attack against it. And it's had that policy in place since 1964, since its first successful nuclear test. All those wars I mentioned, China opposes all those wars. China opposes unilateral sanctions, for example, the blockade on Cuba, the illegal sanctions against Venezuela, against Nicaragua, Zimbabwe, Eritrea, Iran, North Korea. And as for accusations of economic imperialism, the Belt and Road Initiative, which you mentioned, is bringing unprecedented infrastructure development to the global south. It's bringing energy, transport, telecoms to places that haven't had those things, including renewable energy infrastructure, including solar parks, wind energy, hydropower, digital infrastructure to countries that have been suffered under underdevelopment and underdevelopment that's been imposed on these countries, on whole continents by the West through processes of colonialism and imperialism for hundreds of years. Walter Rodney's famous book is called How the West Underdeveloped Africa. That's a verb. They underdeveloped it. It was an active process. So the global south has been held in underdevelopment, and the Belt and Road Initiative is helping to break out of that. Furthermore, the BRI is not associated with any coercion or any domination. About 3/4 of the world's countries are signed up to the BRI. 2/3 of the world's countries have China as their largest trading partner. 53 out of 54 African countries are signed up to the BRI. No African country has been coerced or pressured into signing up. Maybe it's a bit extreme, but I think it's like a little bit patronizing and a little bit racist to suggest that African countries can't deal with China on their own terms, that they can't make their own decisions, and that countries that have experienced brutal colonialism wouldn't recognize it if it were happening to them again.
Thank you for watching the first part of our interview. Please head over to patreon.com/Empire Watch to watch the full episode. The podcast is also available as an audio on Spotify and Amazon Music every Saturday.